parking lot had been repaved. That was the first thing Mikhail noticed. New asphalt, clean lines, the kind of improvement that happens when a building gets old enough to require systematic attention.
The fence was different too. The old one had been chain link, slightly rusted at the posts, the kind of fence you could see through and over and around. This one was taller,
more deliberate. Everything else was the same. He sat in the car for a moment.
He'd driven past this building maybe 100 times over the years, on the way to other places, and had made a practice of not looking. Not a conscious practice.
Just not looking. The way you don't look at a scar you'd rather not be reminded of. He looked now. 3 stories, pale brick. The windows on the second floor where the staff room was still slightly smaller than the others, as if the architects had considered the teacher's comfort a secondary matter. The entrance was the same entrance, the steps worn in the middle from decades of the same foot traffic he'd contributed to.
There was a banner above the door. 25 years. Welcome home.
He checked the time.
11:43. He got out of the car.
He was wearing the gray jacket, the good one, the Italian one. He put it on this morning with a self-awareness he hadn't examined too closely. He walked toward the entrance.
If you've ever gone back to a place you're not entirely sure you wanted to go back to, and gone anyway, for reasons you told yourself were simple, stay with this for a while. Mikhail was 42.
He ran a logistics company that he'd built from a van and a spreadsheet into something with 23 employees and 3 regional contracts. This was true, and he knew it was true, and it remained, after 10 years, the version of himself he led with. Not arrogantly. He wasn't, as a rule, arrogant. But there was something in the way he held the fact of the company that was more than professional pride. Something like proof.
Evidence submitted and accepted. Case closed. He'd grown up in this district, in a building 3 streets from the school. His mother had worked shifts. His father had been the kind of presence that was, in retrospect, worse than absence. Present enough to create damage, absent enough that the damage was inconsistent and therefore unpredictable. Mikhail had learned, young, the specific alertness of a person who doesn't know what they're coming home to.
He'd learned to read rooms before he entered them. This was not a skill you could list on a resume, but it had made him excellent at negotiation.
He'd left this district at 21 with a second-hand car and a fixed conviction that he was done with it. He had not, in the 20 years since, found much reason to revise this. The school years were not something he thought about with warmth.
They were the context out of which he'd clawed, which was the word he used internally, clawed, as if the years themselves had been a surface he'd had to fight his way off. He'd been, to be precise about it, a difficult student.
Not unintelligent. Several of his teachers had said this over the years, in the particular way that indicated they found it frustrating rather than promising. He has the ability, he just doesn't apply it. Which was true, more or less. He had the ability. What he didn't have was any clear reason why applying it would make his life different, or any strong evidence that the people asking him to apply it had his interests in mind rather than their own convenience. He had acted accordingly. His academic record was a complicated thing. Bursts of genuine performance, followed by periods of absence or disruption, followed by a meeting, followed by a warning. Rinse, repeat. He'd been suspended twice. The second time had been serious. Serious enough that he knew now, in the way of an adult who understands institutional processes, that it should have resulted in something more permanent than a suspension.
He'd wondered about that occasionally. Not often. Just occasionally. He pushed open the school doors. Inside, it smelled the same. This was the thing about institutional buildings. The smell was encoded into the walls, some combination of cleaning products and paper and cooked food from the canteen, and 30 years of air that had been breathed and recycled and breathed again. He stood in the entrance hall, and his body recognized it before his mind did. There are people ahead of him. A registration table with 2 women he didn't recognize, name tags, a sign-in sheet. The particular low noise of a reunion, voices at slightly elevated warmth, the performance of remembered affection, the work of picking up threads that had been set down for 25 years. Name?
Mikhail Zuev. She found him on the list.
Handed him a name tag. He looked at it. His name in printed letters, and below it, his graduation year.
He held it for a moment without putting it on. He put it on. He went in. The assembly hall had been arranged for the occasion. Round tables, small centerpieces, photographs along one wall, the kind of display that appears at every institutional reunion and which condenses decades into a narrative of collective growth. He stopped at the photographs.
Class photos. His year, but also the years before and after. A sequence of adolescent faces organized by height. He found himself looking for his own and not finding it immediately, and then finding it. Back row, second from the left. The face of a 16-year-old who had perfected the expression of not caring about having his photograph taken.
He looked at the face for a moment. He thought, I don't know you particularly well. He moved on. There were perhaps 40 people in the hall.
Some faces he recognized instantly, the particular faces that age in predictable ways, the features that persist. Others he was looking for in the wrong decade and couldn't find until they came to him with their names, and then the 17-year-old materialized inside the 42-year-old, like a double exposure. Zuev, Mikhail Zuev.
He turned. The man had a beard now, gray at the edges, and a slightly different way of standing than Mikhail remembered. The settled stance of middle age, but the eyes were the same. The particular alertness of someone who'd always found everything slightly amusing. Oleg, Mikhail said. They shook hands, which became a brief hug in the way these things did.
Oleg had been loosely in his orbit during school, not a close friend, more of a parallel presence, someone who existed in the same approximate zone without being required for anything specific. You look like you're doing something, Oleg said, which was a way of saying, you look expensive.
Logistics company, Mikhail said. Freight, regional distribution. Good?
Good.
They stood for a moment in the ritual of it. Oleg was an architect, which surprised Mikhail in a way he didn't display, because Oleg had seemed, at 17, to be headed somewhere more chaotic.
Life is longer than school makes it seem, Oleg said, as if he'd heard the thought. 42. And I'm finally good at things I was terrible at then.
Mikhail smiled, which was genuine.
He spent the first hour at the level of the surface, moving through the room, exchanging the expected things, accepting the versions of himself that people remembered, and not correcting them, which was easy, because the corrections would require more context than the occasion warranted. Someone remembered him as funny, which he'd been in a particular defensive way. Someone else remembered him as always being late, which was true.
A woman named Dasha, who'd sat in front of him in mathematics, remembered him as impossible to follow because he'd worked at a completely different speed from everyone else and refused to explain his process. He hadn't known she'd noticed. He found himself at the photograph wall again, later, with a glass of something warm. Someone had put up the class registers. The actual registers, the old ledger-style ones, photocopied, with their columns of names and attendance marks and the teacher's handwriting in the margins. He looked at the page for his year, his name in the column, the pattern of absences. Impressive, said a voice beside him.
Even on paper. He turned. He hadn't seen her approach, which was unusual for someone who noticed entrances.
She was perhaps 60, which meant she'd been young when she taught him. Mid-30s, he calculated, which had seemed ancient at the time and now seemed like nothing. She taught chemistry. Her name, which appeared in the margin of the register, was Irina Borisovna.
He thought of her as strict in the way that meant she applied the same standard to everyone and expected everyone to meet it, which had seemed at 16 indistinguishable from indifference. You came, she said.
I came, he said. She looked at him for a moment, with the particular look of someone who was deciding how honest to be. You've done well, she said.
Thank you. I hear that from Alexei. You know he's on the school board now? She nodded toward a man across the room, who was doing something administrative with a stack of folders. He keeps track of people. Good for him, Mikhail said.
He mentioned your company. Did he? She looked at the register. She looked at his absence record. 14 unexcused absences in one term, she said. I've forgotten it was that many.
He said nothing. You know what I remember most? She said. She wasn't looking at him, still looking at the page. You were the only student I had in 30 years who could pass a test on material I hadn't taught him yet. You'd walk in, missing for 2 weeks, and just answer, as if you'd been there the whole time. I read, he said. You read, she said.
Yes, that was the thing nobody knew what to do with. She looked at him now.
Are you going to talk to Nikolai Stepanovich? Mikhail paused. He had seen from across the room, about 40 minutes into the event, the presence of Nikolai Stepanovich. He had noted it the way you note a thing you're not sure what to do with, and then moved in a different direction.
Maybe, he said. Irina Borisovna looked at him with the expression of someone who has taught enough people to know what maybe means in various registers.
She said, "He's not going to be here much longer, you know. His health."
Mikhail looked across the room. Nikolai Stepanovich was talking to two women who'd been in the school's administrative office, and who were now clearly delighted to be talking to him. He was perhaps 75. He'd been the history teacher, and, for a period, the deputy director, which meant he'd been simultaneously the person who taught Mikhail the Crimean War and the person who had authority over disciplinary matters.
He was smaller than Mikhail remembered, which happened with everyone from that time. But he had the same quality, a kind of stillness, a deliberateness, as if each thing he did had been decided rather than happened. Mikhail had not liked him. This was the honest summary. He hadn't liked him in the specific way you don't like someone who sees through your performance and doesn't comment on it, which is more unsettling than being called out. Nikolai Stepanovich had never raised his voice at Mikhail, had never singled him out in front of others, had simply been, consistently, a presence that required him to be more honest than was comfortable. "He's all right," Mikhail said. "His heart," Irina Borisovna said. "Since last year." She paused. "He talks about certain students. Not many, but some."
"I was not one of the students anyone talked about positively," Mikhail said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted and he couldn't read it.
"You might be surprised," she said. He went to find more coffee.
The afternoon turned. More people arrived. The room got warmer and noisier and took on the specific quality of a reunion in full operation. Memory becoming social currency, the past being negotiated into forms that made everyone look reasonable from the current distance. He sat with Oleg and two others he half remembered. They talked about the school as it had been, the heating that never worked in winter, the gym teacher who had operated on principles that would now be considered inappropriate, the canteen's one reliable dish, which had been a matter of considerable debate regarding its actual content. One of the others, a man named Pavel, who Mikhail had forgotten entirely, said, "Remember when Nikolai Stepanovich locked himself out of his own office 3 times in 1 week?"
Laughter. Mikhail found himself almost smiling.
"He came and found me in the yard during break," Pavel said, "because he knew I had a talent for unconventional entry. Never asked me where I'd learned it."
"Just."
"Pavel, I need your assistance with a mechanical matter."
"He was always like that," Oleg said, completely unfazed by things that would have had anyone else reaching for the disciplinary form. Mikhail drank his coffee. "He went to bat for a lot of people," Pavel said, more quietly.
"People don't know. He just did things, and then didn't mention it."
"What kind of things?" Mikhail said.
Pavel looked at him. "Well, me, for one. When I got caught with Vitya Romanov's phone in the classroom." "Caught stealing?" Mikhail said. "I'd borrowed it." The boundary between borrowed and stolen wasn't clear in the moment. Anyway, the formal path was parental meeting, formal record, the disciplinary committee. Nikolai Stepanovich found out before it went further and had a conversation with Vidya's family. Not on my behalf officially.
Just a conversation. The formal path stopped. He looked into his coffee. "I didn't find out for years. Vitya's mother told me at some point. She said he'd sat with her for an hour and talked her through why ruining a 14-year-old's record over a phone was not the kind of justice she actually wanted."
Silence for a moment. "That sounds like him," Oleg said. "It does," Pavel said. Mikhail set his cup down. He looked across the room to where Nikolai Stepanovich was still talking, now with someone from a younger cohort. He thought about the second suspension, the one that had been serious. He thought about the specific thing he'd done, which he still knew in full detail because it was the kind of thing you knew. He'd gotten into an argument with a vice principal from another school during an inter-school event, an argument that had become physical in the technical sense, which meant nothing had been broken and no one had been injured, but which had been witnessed by enough people to become a documented incident. The result had been a meeting, and then another meeting, and then a very quiet period during which nothing was said to Mikhail directly, and then a suspension, and then nothing. He had always assumed nothing because the institution had been incompetent at follow-through, or because his file had been lost in some administrative gap, or because he'd simply been beneath the threshold of consequence.
He had never asked. He looked across the room. He thought. Why didn't I ask? He knew why. Because asking meant opening the door to a version of the story in which he was not the only author. He got up. He crossed the room. Nikolai Stepanovich saw him coming from several meters away. His face did something. Not surprise, not a performance of reunion warmth. Something more like, the specific recognition of someone who had been expecting this, or had given up expecting it, and found they were surprised to be wrong. Mikhail Dmitrievich, he said. Nikolai Stepanovich. They shook hands. The teacher's grip was still firm, which was somehow both reassuring and slightly uncomfortable. You look like you landed, the teacher said. I did, Mikhail said. Eventually. Logistics, I'm told. You followed the alumni? Not systematically, but some news travels. A pause. The small smile of a man who found things gently amusing. You hated my classes.
I didn't hate them, Mikhail said. I thought they were irrelevant.
You thought history was irrelevant.
At 16, I thought most things were irrelevant.
That's fair, the teacher said.
At 16, most of my students thought I was irrelevant. I took it as a sign I was doing something right. Relevance, at that age, usually means you're telling them what they want to hear. Mikhail looked at the man. 75, his health, Irina Borisovna had said.
He looked. Smaller, yes. And there was something about the way he stood that suggested the body requiring more management than it used to. But his eyes were the same eyes,
the ones that had always looked through the performance. I heard you talk to Vitya Romanov's family, Mikhail said. Years ago. The teacher looked at him steadily. Pavel told me, Mikhail said. Just now, Pavel, the teacher said.
He seemed to be placing him. Ah, yes. He said you intervened.
Stopped it going formally.
It was a phone, the teacher said. The boy was 14.
Did you do that kind of thing often?
A pause.
The kind that was considering rather than hesitant. When it seemed like the system was about to do something permanent about something temporary, the teacher said, yes, sometimes.
Mikhail stood with this. He thought, ask.
He thought, don't ask. He thought, if you leave without asking, you'll spend another 20 years not knowing. And 20 years from now, there may not be anyone to ask. He said, the incident in 1999.
The inter-school thing. Nikolai Stepanovich was very still. I've always assumed it dropped, Mikhail said.
The formal process. I assumed it was administrative. The teacher looked at him for a moment.
Let's find somewhere quieter, he said. Pause. If you've ever been about to find out something that rearranges a story you've been telling about yourself, you know what the next few minutes feel like.
We'll go there slowly. There was a classroom off the main corridor that wasn't being used for the event. Nikolai Stepanovich knew where it was without asking, which was the knowledge of someone who had spent 30 years in the building. He walked steadily, if slightly more slowly than Mikhail imagined he once had, and pushed open the door. The classroom was a classroom.
Desks in rows, the kind that hadn't changed in design in 40 years. A whiteboard where there used to be a blackboard. A window looking out onto the yard, the same yard. The one where Mikhail had spent more hours than he'd spent in class during certain semesters. They sat across from each other at the front desks, which had an awkward geometry. These desks were sized for students, and both of them were adult men in their 40s and 70s, and neither of them said anything about this. The incident was going to be an exclusion, the teacher said.
He said it without preamble. Mikhail had expected more approach.
The directness landed somewhere in his chest. I know, Mikhail said. I thought it...
It should have been, the teacher said, by the rules. What you did was serious enough, and it was public enough, and there were people in the administration who felt an example needed to be made. He looked at the whiteboard.
I disagreed. Mikhail waited. I knew your situation at home, the teacher said.
Not everything. Enough. I knew that school for you was the only structured environment that existed.
I knew what happened to boys like you when the structured environment stopped. I'd seen it enough times to know the shape of it. He paused. And I knew, this is not flattery, it's just what I thought then, that you were not someone who should be discarded. You were someone who needed the door to stay open.
Mikhail looked at the desk. The desk had something carved into the surface under the varnish from years ago. He couldn't read it from his angle.
What did you do? He said.
I asked for a meeting with the director. I presented a case for a formal suspension with probationary return rather than exclusion. I was specific about what I thought you were capable of. I talked about the context. I talked about what was likely to happen if the decision went one way rather than the other. He looked at Mikhail.
And then I agreed to take personal responsibility for your behavior for the remainder of the year, which was not a small thing to agree to.
Mikhail said nothing. The director was not immediately persuaded, the teacher said.
It took 2 meetings and a conversation with your class tutor, who was also not immediately persuaded.
But eventually, a suspension, probationary return, no formal exclusion on your record.
Outside the classroom window, the art was empty. The new fence was visible from here. Why? Mikhail said. I told you. No, I mean... He stopped. He looked at his hands on the desk. The hands of a 42-year-old who ran a company, which were the same hands that had been in that argument at 16, which had done the thing that should have ended everything. Why me? There were other students in worse situations. Why spend the 2 meetings on me?
The teacher looked at him. Because you were the one in front of me, he said. That's not a small answer. It's the true one. I can't save everyone in the abstract. I can sometimes do something for the person who's actually there.
He paused.
And because, he said, I'd been watching you for 2 years by then, and I thought, this one is going to get out, or he's going to fall, and what happens next is going to be determined by something quite small. A door open or closed. That kind of small. Mikhail sat in the classroom that smelled like every classroom he'd ever been in.
He thought about the thing he'd spent 20 years believing, that he had gotten out on his own, that the success of the company, the van and the spreadsheet, and the 23 employees and the regional contracts was the product of his own determination, unassisted, earned in full by the force of his own refusal to stay in the place he'd come from. He thought, this is still true.
He thought, it is also not the whole truth. He thought about a door, just the door, in the metaphor the teacher had used, which was not a metaphor. It was the actual door of the school, the actual return after the suspension, the actual not exclusion that had meant he'd finished his final year and received the certificate and had, therefore, the thing you needed to have before you could have anything else. He thought, I have been building my life on a foundation that someone else helped lay, and I did not know this, and I did not know it because he never told me. He said, why didn't you tell me? The teacher looked at him, slight surprise maybe, or maybe not surprise, maybe something that had been waiting to be asked.
What would it have done? He said. At 16, Mikhail considered this honestly.
I'd have been angry, he said. I'd have thought... You'd have thought it was interference, the teacher said. You'd have thought someone had made a decision about your life without your permission, which, to be fair, was true. He looked at the window. Or you'd have felt obligated. An obligation at that age has a weight that can work against the thing you're trying to do. He paused. I wanted you to finish the year, not to feel that you owed something.
Just to finish.
And after? Mikhail said. After wasn't my concern.
You were gone. You were out in the world doing what you were going to do. The door was the thing. What you did after the door. He made a small gesture. That was yours.
Mikhail looked at the desk.
At the carved-in thing under the varnish. He thought about all the iterations of his own origin story, the ones he'd told, the ones he'd told himself. I built this from nothing. I had nothing, and I made something. Both technically true. Both, he now understood, slightly edited.
The door had been held open. He'd walked through it.
The walking was his. The holding was not. He thought about his father, and about what it meant to receive help from a man who was strict and demanding, and who you had, at the time, no particular reason to believe was on your side.
He thought, I had no idea you were on my side. He thought, that's the point, isn't it? That was the whole point. Something in him, which was not exactly emotion, but was in the vicinity, tightened, and then didn't quite release, and he recognized it as the particular feeling of a large thing being asked to move through a small opening. He said, I didn't appreciate you when I was here.
No, the teacher said, simply.
Without injury. I thought you were... He tried to find the honest word. I thought you were part of the system that was holding me down.
I thought the school was something I needed to get through and out of, and everyone in it was part of the obstacle. That's a reasonable way to see it, the teacher said. From where you were,
he was an accurate number. But most things aren't at 16. You get better information as you go. He looked at Mikhail. You got out.
You built something. That's the point. That's what the 2 meetings were for. Mikhail looked at him. He thought about the word sorry and all the things it would be inadequate to carry.
He thought about 25 years, and a company, and a gray Italian jacket worn for an occasion that was proving to be something entirely different from what he'd expected. He thought about a version of himself that had driven here to show what he'd become, and a version of himself now, sitting in a student desk, being shown something instead. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it at the time."
"You weren't supposed to see it at the time," the teacher said.
"I just told you."
Still,
the teacher looked at him for a moment. "You're seeing it now," he said. That was all. They were quiet for a moment in the classroom that smelled of 30 years. The event continued outside the door. Muffled voices, the particular noise of people who were trying to remember each other across 25 years.
in here it was just 2 desks and the window and the carved thing under the varnish that Mikhail still couldn't read from his angle. He shifted and looked at it.
Letters from a decade he couldn't pin. Probably a name, probably someone who'd sat in this desk and needed to put something permanent in the world, the way students did. He thought, I sat in a desk like this for 3 years, and I didn't carve anything.
I left nothing here. I came in and I left and I was gone. And someone held a door open for me and I walked through it and I went and built a life and didn't look back.
He thought, I owe this place something. Not the feeling of obligation the teacher had described. The heavy kind, the kind that can work against things. Something different, something he was trying to locate precisely. He looked at Nikolai Stepanovich.
"How is the school?" he said. The teacher looked at him.
Slightly surprised again. Underfunded, he said, as always. The science lab equipment is not of this decade. The library has been trying to update its collection for 3 years and has the budget for approximately... He paused.
Approximately nothing.
The library, Mikhail said. It's where you spent the time you weren't in class, the teacher said, in case you'd forgotten. Mikhail hadn't forgotten.
The library had been, in the most literal sense, where he'd survived the school years. Not emotionally, not in a dramatic sense, but practically. He'd learned things there because the books were available, and the librarian, a woman named Tamara who had retired long ago, had left him alone in a way that felt like respect rather than indifference.
He'd read his way through whole shelves without any assigned reason. Some of what he'd read, he realized now, had formed him more directly than anything that had happened in a classroom. What does the library need? He said.
The teacher looked at him carefully, the look of someone assessing whether a question is genuine. Books, primarily, he said. Subscriptions to databases that the students can use for actual research. The furniture is... He made a face.
The furniture is from a different era. How much? Mikhail said. Mikhail Dmitrievich.
I'm asking practically.
What would a proper renovation and restock cost?
The teacher was quiet for a moment. I can find out, he said. If you're...
Find out, Mikhail said.
I'll give you a number to reach me.
He took out a card. The company card. The one with just his name and the number and the email. Nothing elaborate. And put it on the desk. The teacher looked at the card. He looked at Mikhail. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, Mikhail said. It won't... The teacher stopped. He seemed to be finding words.
It won't change what happened. The 25 years. I know, Mikhail said.
I'm not doing it for that. He thought about how to explain what he was doing it for, and couldn't find the explanation that was precise enough to be worth saying. He thought, because a door was held open and I walked through it, and now I'd like to hold one open for someone who hasn't come through yet. He thought, because I built something, and some part of the foundation was someone else's, and I want to know that I know that, he thought. Because the library is where I learn things, because the least I can do is let that still be possible.
He didn't say any of this. He put the card on the desk and left it there. The teacher picked it up.
He looked at it. He said, I'll ask the librarian to put together a proper list. Good, Mikhail said. They sat in the classroom for another minute without talking, which was not uncomfortable in the way he'd have expected, just 2 people in a room, after a thing that had been said and couldn't be unsaid, with some time to sit in it before returning to the event outside the door. Mikhail looked at the yard through the window.
He thought about himself at 16 in that yard. The particular version, the version that had thought it was alone in everything, that had built the aloneness into a principle, that had been proud of the aloneness the way you're proud of the things you mistake for strength.
He thought, I was not alone. He thought, I just didn't know.
He thought. That makes it better and worse simultaneously. He thought about the two meetings. An adult man, a teacher, a deputy director, sitting across a desk from an administrator and making the case for a student who had no idea anyone was making a case for him, who was probably in the yard at that moment, or in the library, or somewhere not in class, unaware that the trajectory of his life was being discussed by people he'd assumed were indifferent to it. He thought, what does it cost someone to do that? He thought, it costs something. It's not free. You take on the responsibility.
You spend the meetings. You put your credibility behind a person who has given you no particular reason to believe in him, except that you see something in him that he can't see from the inside.
He thought, I never even said thank you. He said, I didn't say thank you, at the time or at any point since.
The teacher made a slight gesture.
The wave of someone who is about to say, it doesn't matter. It matters, Mikhail said. I know you're going to say it doesn't. I'm saying it does. I should have, at some point,
said something. I didn't because I didn't know. But even the things I did know, you were a good teacher. I thought your subject was irrelevant, and I was wrong about that too.
The teacher looked at him. He said, history, yes? You thought it was irrelevant. I thought a lot of things.
Do you still?
Mikhail thought about his company, about negotiating contracts and reading people and knowing what room you were walking into, about the patterns of how power worked and how deals moved and how people defended things that had been theirs for a long time.
About all of this, which he'd learned partly in boardrooms and partly on the job and partly, he now admitted to himself, in a library where he'd read things with no assigned reason. No, he said.
I don't steal. The teacher looked at him, and then something happened with his face that Mikhail hadn't expected and couldn't quite categorize. A small thing in the vicinity of the eyes, the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just, quietly, been permitted to set it down. He thought, this matters to him. This specific moment, this conversation. He thought, he has been a teacher for how many years? And some percentage of the people he taught walked out of the school and never thought of him again. And some of those people are in the hall right now doing the reunion and might never come through this door, he thought. I almost didn't come through this door, he thought. I almost sat in the hall all day talking about the gym teacher and the canteen food and driven home before dark. He said, I almost didn't come today. What made you come? The teacher said. Mikhail thought about it honestly. I wanted to show what I'd become, he said. I'm not. That's the honest answer. I came to be seen.
The teacher looked at him without judgment. And? He said. And I'm being seen, Mikhail said. Not by the people I thought.
They went back to the events. The afternoon had gotten louder in their absence, the comfortable noise of people who have found their rhythm. Mikhail got coffee and stood at the edge of things for a moment, watching. He watched Nikolai Stepanovich re-enter the room and be met by someone's enthusiasm, and watched the teacher respond with the same quality he'd always had. Present, specific, not performing warmth, but having it.
He watched Irina Borisovna arguing good-naturedly with someone about something pedagogical. He watched Pavel and Oleg talking with the ease of people who'd been talking that way since they were 17. He thought, this place made something in me. He thought, I've spent 20 years in rebellion against a place that also made me. He thought, both things are true, and I'm 42, and I've only just worked this out. He found Oleg. He said, Can I ask you something?
Oleg said, That's an ominous phrasing.
Nikolai Stepanovich.
What do you remember about him? Oleg thought about it. Fair, he said. Demanding but fair. He had this way of looking at you when you said something incorrect that made you feel like the error was something you could do better, not something you were. He paused. I remember once I completely failed a test.
Not just failed. Failed in a way that suggested I hadn't done any of the reading. Which I hadn't. He called me in and I was expecting. He made an expressive gesture. And instead he said, what happened? Not accusatory.
Just, what happened? And I told him, because the question was honest enough that the honest answer was the only one that made sense. He looked across the room.
I did the reading after that. Did you know he intervened for people? Formally? In disciplinary situations?
I heard some things, Oleg said.
Over the years, not at the time. He looked at Mikhail. He did something for you?
Mikhail said. I found out today.
Oleg was quiet. I almost got excluded, Mikhail said. 99. The thing with the inter-school event. It should have been a permanent exclusion. He made a case. 2 meetings.
Oleg looked at him for a moment.
Did you know?
I didn't know.
All this time? All this time. They stood together looking at the man across the room. How does that feel? Oleg said. Mikhail thought about how to answer this honestly. He said, like I've been reading a map of a place I've already been, and the map has details I missed the first time.
He drove home later than he'd expected. He sat in the car in his own parking space at home for longer than he needed to before going in.
He wasn't examining anything exactly. He was just sitting, letting the day be what it had been, without immediately filing it away into something manageable.
He thought about the library. He'd called his assistant on the drive home briefly and asked her to reserve some capacity next quarter for a project he'd describe later. She'd said, "Understood. Send the details when you have them." He would. He thought about whether to tell anyone.
His wife, when he got inside, would ask how it was. He'd say, "Different from what I expected." She'd wait to see if there was more. There would be more, but not tonight. Tonight he was still inside it. He thought about the classroom. He thought about the desk and the carved name he'd never been able to read. The anonymous student who'd needed to put something permanent into the surface.
He thought about Tamara, the librarian, who'd left him alone in the way that felt like respect. He thought about a man sitting across a desk from an administrator, making the case for a 16-year-old who was in the yard and didn't know. He thought, not all care is loud. He thought, some of it is 2 meetings you never find out about. Some of it is leaving a door open and not watching to see if anyone comes through it.
Some of it is a library where a difficult student can sit for hours reading things for no assigned reason, because someone made that space available, and that space, decades later, is still somewhere inside him. He thought, I would be a different person, or I would not be a person at all if that door had closed.
He went inside. His wife said, "How was it?"
He said, "Different from what I expected."
She looked at him. She knew the other version, the one he'd been carrying for 25 years. The school as obstacle, the district as something left behind, the past as evidence of a difficulty overcome.
She'd heard it enough times to know its shape. She waited. He said, I found out about something today. Something someone did for me a long time ago that I didn't know about. He sat down. I'm processing it.
She sat across from him.
He said, do you know how you can think you built something entirely alone and then find out the ground it was built on had help in it? He paused. And it doesn't take away what you built.
But it changes the story. The one you've been telling.
She said, yes. He said, I'm going to help the school. Quietly.
The library. He paused. Not for the event.
Not for the record. I don't want it to be a named thing.
She looked at him. Okay, she said. I want it to just be done and exist. And maybe someone sits in there reading something for no assigned reason, and whatever it does for them, that's the point, she said. Okay. He sat with her in the kitchen. He thought about the teacher. About the health thing Irina Borsona had mentioned. About how much time there was and wasn't, and how you didn't know until you were in a classroom at a reunion, finding out about 2 meetings that happened 25 years ago. He picked up his phone.
He opened the contact he'd created on the drive home, the number the teacher had given him, slightly carefully, as if unused to being the one whose number was taken. He typed, Thank you for today. I'll be in touch about the library. Monsieur Zouev. He looked at the message. He sent it. 3 minutes later, his phone showed a response. Just good.
He put the phone down. He thought, 25 years of not knowing, and a day of knowing, and nothing goes back and nothing is fixed. The past is the past, and the 16-year-old in the yard had no idea, and he still didn't have any idea. And those years happened the way they happened. But the knowing was different from the not knowing. The knowing changed the story, not the events, the meaning underneath the events. The door that had been held open could now be acknowledged, which was not the same as not needing it, but was something. Was the beginning of something.
He thought. You spent 25 years thinking I owed the world nothing. He thought, I was wrong. He thought, I'm going to be better with that. He looked at the kitchen, his apartment, his city.
All of it built from something that had a foundation he hadn't fully known. He thought about the library, The new shelves, the subscriptions, the students who would sit in there next year and the year after, reading things for no assigned reason, learning things in the sideways way that turned out to matter.
He thought about not putting his name on it. He thought about how much better that was. He thought, someone left the door open and never said anything. I can do that. He got up and went to find his wife. There are people who did things for you that you don't know about. Teachers, neighbors, someone at a desk in an administrative office who made a different decision than the easy one. Some of them are still reachable. Some of them aren't. Some of what they did you'll never find out. But occasionally, you're in a room and something is said, and the map of your own life gets one detail added that changes how the whole thing reads. If there's someone you haven't thanked, not because you forgot, but because you didn't know you needed to, it might be worth finding out. Leave something in the comments if this stayed with you. We'll see you next time.